The candles in the ballroom of Ashcombe House had barely been lit when the first laugh rang out, sharp and cruel, cutting through the music like a blade through silk. Edmund Ashworth froze mid-step, his cane striking the polished floor a half-second too late, and the sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. Every head turned, every fan stopped moving. For one long, terrible moment, the Earl of Rivenhall stood alone in the center of attention he never wanted, his left leg trembling beneath him, his face burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the roaring fireplace behind him. "Look at him try," someone whispered, not quietly enough. "Poor creature. He should stay home, where no one has to watch." Edmund gripped his cane tighter. He did not look toward the voice. He had learned, over 3 long years, that looking only invited more cruelty. Instead, he straightened his shoulders, nodded once to the startled hostess beside him, and made his way toward the edge of the room, each step a small, private battle that no one in that glittering crowd cared to understand. 3 years earlier, Edmund Ashworth had been one of the finest riders in the county. Men had envied his seat on a horse, and women had watched him cross a ballroom with the kind of ease that made every other gentleman in the room seem clumsy by comparison. Then came the accident. A frightened horse, a narrow bridge over swollen water, and a fall that shattered his leg in 3 places. The surgeons had saved his life. They had not been able to save the leg's strength, and no amount of money or determination had been able to buy it back. Since that day, the world he once moved through so easily had become a stage for his humiliation. Every ball was the same. He was pointed at, whispered about, and occasionally pitied by some kind soul who meant well but only made things worse. He had considered, more than once, simply refusing every invitation for the rest of his life. But his mother, before she passed, had made him promise never to hide. "A man who hides," she had said, "teaches the world that shame is deserved. Do not teach them that, Edmund." So he came. He endured, and every single time, he told himself it would be the last. Tonight, however, something was different. From across the ballroom, half hidden behind a cluster of chattering dowagers, Cecilia Hartwell watched the scene unfold, with an expression that had nothing to do with pity. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes, a deep and steady brown, followed the young men who had laughed, memorizing their faces the way one might memorize the face of an enemy on a battlefield. Cecilia was 26 years old, an age at which society had long since stopped considering her a prospect, and started referring to her, behind gloved hands and painted fans, as a spinster. She had heard the word so many times that it had lost its sting years ago. What had not lost its sting, not even slightly, was watching a man be mocked for something he could not help, by boys who had never once been tested by anything harder than choosing a cravat. "Cecilia!" her Aunt Beatrice murmured beside her. "Do not stare! It is not becoming!" "I am not staring at him," Cecilia said quietly. "I am staring at them." Her aunt followed her gaze toward the cluster of young dandies, still snickering near the punch table, and sighed the particular sigh she reserved for moments when her niece was about to do something unwise. "Whatever thought is forming in that head of yours, I beg you to let it pass. You have caused enough talk this season already." Cecilia said nothing. She had, in fact, caused a great deal of talk that season, though not through any scandal of her own making. She had simply refused, again and again, to pretend enthusiasm for suitors chosen more for their titles than their character. At 26, unmarried, and increasingly unwilling to apologize for either fact, she had become something of a curiosity in London society, an oddity to be discussed over tea and dismissed over supper. She watched Edmund Ashworth make his way to a chair near the wall, moving with the careful precision of a man who had long since stopped expecting the world to make space for him. There was no self-pity in his face, she noticed. There was only a kind of tired dignity, the look of someone who had decided, somewhere along the way, that he would not give his tormentors the satisfaction of seeing him break. She found herself unable to look away. "Miss Hartwell," a voice at her elbow made her turn. It was Henry Whitfield, a family friend and one of the few men in the room whose opinion she actually valued. "You look as though you are planning a small war." "Perhaps I am," Cecilia said. "Tell me, Henry, who are those young men laughing by the punch table?" Henry glanced over, his easy smile fading slightly. "Lord Pemberton's younger sons, mostly, and a cousin of the Duke of Wexford, I believe. They fancy themselves wits. They fancy themselves many things they are not," Cecilia said. Henry studied her for a moment. You are thinking of the Earl of Rivenhall. I am thinking, Cecilia said carefully, that a room full of grown men and women just watched another man be humiliated for the crime of walking with a limp, and not one of them said a word in his defense. I find that far more shameful than anything he could have done tonight. Henry did not argue with her. He rarely did, which was one of the reasons she liked him. Across the room, Edmund had settled into a chair near a tall window, grateful for the relative quiet of the corner. He allowed himself, for just a moment, to close his eyes and breathe. The music continued. The dancing continued. Life, as it always did, moved on without waiting for him. He opened his eyes to find a young woman standing directly in front of him. She was not conventionally positioned to be noticed at that moment, dressed simply compared to the elaborate gowns swirling across the dance floor. But there was something in the way she stood, steady and unhurried, that made him sit up a little straighter despite himself. My lord, she said, offering a small, polite curtsy, I do not believe we have been introduced. Cecilia Hartwell. Edmund blinked, momentarily uncertain how to respond. Young women rarely approached him directly anymore, not since the accident. Those who once might have sought his company now found reasons to be elsewhere whenever he entered a room. Miss Hartwell, he said, recovering himself and offering a slight bow from where he sat, an awkward gesture he had grown practiced at making look intentional. Edmund Ashworth. Though I suspect you already know that, given the entertainment I provided a few minutes ago. I saw what happened, Cecilia said, without softening the truth, or pretending she had not noticed. I thought it was unkind. Unkind is a generous word for it, Edmund said, a dry edge creeping into his voice. Most people simply call it Tuesday. Cecilia's lips curved, not quite a smile, but close. Then most people have very low standards for their evenings. Edmund studied her for a moment, uncertain whether she was mocking him gently or genuinely amused. There was no pity in her expression, he realized, and that alone set her apart from nearly everyone else who had spoken to him since his accident. You are very direct, Miss Hartwell. I have been told it is one of my great flaws, she said, along with my age, my opinions, and my apparent inability to find a husband suitable enough for my family's taste. Those sound less like flaws, Edmund said, and more like a list of reasons. The wrong sort of people find you inconvenient. Cecilia laughed then, a genuine sound that turned a few heads nearby, though she did not seem to notice or care. That, my lord, may be the kindest thing anyone has said to me all season. They spoke for a few more minutes, and Edmund found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, forgetting entirely about his leg. She asked him nothing about the accident, offered no soft words of sympathy, made no attempt to look away from his cane as though it were something shameful to be overlooked. She spoke to him as though he were simply a man at a ball, which he had not felt like in 3 long years. Then, without warning, Cecilia extended her hand. Would you dance with me, Lord Rivenhall? The words landed in the small space between them, like a stone dropped into still water. Edmund stared at her, certain he had misheard. Around them, though the music continued, several nearby conversations had quietly stopped. A ripple of attention was already spreading outward, the way it always did, in rooms like this one, hungry for anything unusual to feed upon. Miss Hartwell, Edmund said carefully, I think you may not fully understand what you are asking. I understand perfectly well, Cecilia said. I am asking a gentleman to dance with me. It is, I believe, a fairly ordinary request at a ball. My leg does not allow for ordinary dancing, Edmund said, his voice lower now, aware of the eyes beginning to gather at the edges of his vision. I would embarrass you. I have sat through 4 seasons of ordinary dancing, Cecilia said, and found most of it thoroughly dull. I am not asking for ordinary. I am asking for a dance with you. For a long moment, Edmund said nothing. He looked at her outstretched hand, then at her face, searching for any trace of pity, mockery, or foolish impulsiveness that would make sense of what she was doing. He found none of it. What he found instead was patience, and something that looked remarkably like respect. Slowly, carefully, he rose from his chair, leaning more heavily on his cane than he would have liked anyone to see. The room had gone quieter now, the way a room does when it senses a moment worth remembering. Somewhere near the punch table, the young men who had laughed earlier had fallen silent. watching with expressions caught somewhere between confusion and discomfort. "I cannot promise grace," Edmund said quietly, taking her offered hand. "I did not ask for grace," Cecilia replied. "I asked for a dance." What followed was not, by any strict measure, a conventional performance. Edmund's steps were slow, careful, and deliberate. His cane set aside, and his weight braced instead, against Cecilia's steady hand and the quiet strength of her presence beside him. She adjusted her own pace without a word, matching his rhythm rather than expecting him to match hers, turning what might have been an awkward spectacle into something quieter and, strangely, more beautiful than the polished performances happening elsewhere on the floor. The whispers had not stopped entirely. They rarely did, in rooms full of people who thrived on the misfortune of others. But for the first time in 3 years, Edmund found that he did not care. He was aware, with a kind of quiet astonishment, that he was smiling, actually smiling, in the middle of a ballroom that had spent 3 years teaching him to expect nothing but scorn. When the dance ended, Cecilia curtsied properly, as though nothing unusual had occurred at all. "Thank you, my lord," she said. "That was far more graceful than most of the dancing I have witnessed tonight." Edmund, recovering his cane and his composure, allowed himself a small, genuine smile. "You are either very brave, Miss Hartwell, or very reckless." "Perhaps a little of both," Cecilia said, "though I have always preferred to think of it as simply refusing to be as small-minded as the people around me." As she walked away to rejoin her aunt, Edmund remained standing near the window a moment longer than necessary, watching her go, aware that something in the evening had shifted in a way he did not yet fully understand. Across the room, Beatrice Hartwell was already fanning herself with visible agitation, clearly preparing a lecture her niece had no intention of heeding. And near the punch table, the young men who had laughed earlier now found themselves the subject of a very different kind of whispering, one considerably less flattering than the mockery they had offered only minutes before. Edmund Ashworth left Ashcombe House that night, still uncertain of his footing, still leaning on the same cane he had leaned on for 3 long years, but for the first time since the accident that changed his life, he walked out into the cold night air, feeling, however briefly, like a man worth noticing for something other than his limp. He did not yet know her family's expectations, her reasons for remaining unmarried so long, or the powerful suitor already circling her with quiet confidence. He knew only that Cecilia Hartwell had looked at him, truly looked at him, and had not once flinched. It was, he would later realize, the beginning of everything that followed. Cecilia Hartwell woke the next morning to the sound of her aunt's footsteps pacing outside her bedroom door, a sound she had learned over the years to recognize as the prelude to a lecture. She sat up against her pillows, pulled her shawl around her shoulders, and waited, knowing full well that no amount of pretending to be asleep would spare her. The door opened without a knock. Beatrice Hartwell stood in the doorway, still in her dressing gown, her gray hair pinned hastily, her expression somewhere between alarm and exasperation. "The entire street will be talking of it by noon," Beatrice said. "A dance with the Earl of Rivenhall, in front of half of London's finest families." "I danced with a gentleman at a ball, Aunt. I was under the impression that was the entire purpose of attending one." "You danced with him," Beatrice said, stepping further into the room, after he was mocked by half the room, in a manner that made certain everyone would remember exactly whose hand he took to recover his dignity. "Do you understand what people will say?" "I imagine they will say I have poor judgment," Cecilia said, folding her hands calmly in her lap. "They have said as much before, and I have survived it." Beatrice sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the fight draining from her posture as quickly as it had arrived. She had raised Cecilia since the girl was 12 years old, following the deaths of her parents within the same terrible winter, and she loved her niece with a fierce, protective devotion that often expressed itself as worry rather than warmth. "Cecilia," she said, more gently now, "you are 26 years old. Do you understand what that means in the eyes of society? Every year that passes without a proposal, your prospects grow smaller. I am not saying this to wound you. I am saying it because someone must. I am aware of my age, Aunt. I am reminded of it at every gathering I attend, usually by someone eager to point out how many younger, prettier girls have already found husbands while I remain unclaimed, as though I were a piece of furniture left too long in a shop window." "Then why," Beatrice pressed, Would you choose, of all possible partners, a man whose own situation invites exactly the kind of talk you can least afford? A man who cannot even dance without difficulty, whatever kindness you meant by it. Cecilia's expression hardened slightly, though her voice remained steady. Because he was mocked by fools who have never once been tested by real hardship, and not a single person in that room thought to defend him. I could not stand by and watch it happen without doing something. Kindness is admirable, Beatrice said. But kindness and courtship are not the same thing, and you know it, especially not when the Duke of Wexford has made his interest in you perfectly clear. At the mention of the Duke, Cecilia's expression flickered, though she quickly smoothed it into something more neutral. Alistair Vane, Duke of Wexford, had indeed made his interest known over the past several weeks, calling on her twice, sending flowers she had not particularly wanted, and speaking to her with the easy confidence of a man entirely certain of his own appeal. He was, by any measure society cared to apply, an excellent match, wealthy, titled, handsome in the conventional manner that made portraits of him sell well among admiring young ladies, and possessed of manners polished to a fine, practiced shine. He was also, Cecilia had noticed on more than one occasion, a man who spoke to her more than he listened to her, and who seemed to view their eventual marriage as a settled matter requiring only the formality of her agreement. The Duke has made his interest known, Cecilia said carefully. He has not yet asked for my hand, and I have not yet given him reason to expect I would accept without consideration. Consideration, Beatrice repeated, with the particular weariness of someone who had heard this argument many times before. Cecilia, a duke does not appear on a woman's doorstep merely to be considered. He appears because he expects to be accepted, and when a woman of your age hesitates too long, the offer does not remain on the table indefinitely. Then perhaps it should not remain on the table at all, Cecilia said quietly, if the man offering it cannot be bothered to actually know me first. Beatrice sighed, recognizing the particular stubbornness in her niece's voice that no argument, however reasonable, had ever managed to overcome. I only want to see you settled, my dear. Safely, comfortably, before I am no longer here to look after you. The words softened something in Cecilia's chest, and she reached across the bed to take her aunt's hand. I know, Aunt Beatrice, and I promise you, I have no intention of remaining unmarried out of stubbornness alone. I simply intend to choose someone I can actually respect, rather than someone chosen for me by title and fortune alone. Beatrice studied her niece's face for a long moment, then rose with a small, resigned shake of her head. Just be careful, Cecilia. Whatever kindness moved you last night, do not let it become something the whole of London uses against you. After her aunt left the room, Cecilia sat quietly for some time, turning over the events of the previous evening in her mind. She thought of the young men laughing near the punch table, their cruelty so casual it had barely registered to them as cruelty at all. She thought of the quiet dignity with which Edmund Ashworth had risen from his chair despite it, refusing to let their laughter break something in him that 3 years of similar mockery had apparently failed to break already. And she thought, with a small, private smile she did not entirely understand, of the surprised warmth in his eyes when she had extended her hand. Later that same afternoon, in his own townhouse across the city, Edmund Ashworth sat in his study attempting, without much success, to focus on a stack of correspondence regarding his estate's tenant farms. His sister, Margaret, had called on him not an hour earlier, and the conversation still lingered uncomfortably in his thoughts. You danced, Margaret had said, settling into the chair across from his desk, with the particular satisfaction of someone delivering gossip she considered good news. The whole of London is already speaking of it, Edmund. A dance with Miss Hartwell, after Pemberton's sons made such fools of themselves. Everyone says it was the most talked-about moment of the entire ball. Everyone says a great many things, Edmund had replied, not looking up from his papers. Most of it worth very little attention. You liked her, Margaret had said, not a question. Edmund had not answered directly, though the silence that followed had apparently told his sister everything she wished to know, given the satisfied smile she wore as she left his study a short while later. Now alone, Edmund allowed himself to consider the truth of his sister's observation. He had liked Cecilia Hartwell, more than liked her, if he was honest with himself, which he tried, on principle, to be. There had been something in the directness of her gaze, the absence of pity in her voice, the simple, unadorned courage of her decision to approach him at all. that he had not encountered in any woman since his accident. Perhaps not ever, if he considered the matter fully. But he was also aware, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent 3 years learning exactly how the world regarded him now, of the risks such an attachment carried. Cecilia Hartwell was unmarried at 26, true, but she remained one of the most sought-after women of her circle, for reasons that had nothing to do with desperation, and everything to do with her wit, her beauty, and the quiet strength of character that even her critics could not entirely deny. She could, if she chose, marry a duke. She did not need to attach herself to a man whose leg trembled after a single dance, whose presence at any gathering invited whispers before he had even crossed the threshold. He set down his pen and moved, with the careful effort that had become second nature to him, toward the window overlooking the street below. A carriage rattled past, its wheels striking the cobblestones in a steady rhythm that matched, oddly, the uneven rhythm of his own thoughts. He would not seek her out again, he decided. Whatever kindness she had shown him the previous evening, however genuine it had felt in the moment, he would not repay it by drawing her into the kind of scrutiny that attached itself to him wherever he went. She deserved better than a life spent defending her choices to a society eager to mock them both. It was, he told himself firmly, a sensible decision. A responsible one. The kind of decision a man of good character made when he cared enough about someone not to burden them with his own difficulties. He held to that decision for exactly 4 days. On the 5th day, a note arrived at his townhouse, delivered by a young footman who waited politely for a response. Edmund recognized the handwriting immediately, though he had seen it only once before, on a small card accompanying flowers she had sent to his sister the previous week, as a courtesy following their acquaintance. The note was brief. My lord, I find myself in need of a walking companion for tomorrow's outing to Hyde Park, and I am told you possess an excellent knowledge of horses, a subject on which my own understanding remains embarrassingly limited. Should your schedule permit, I would welcome your company and your expertise. Yours, C. Hartwell. Edmund read the note 3 times before setting it down on his desk, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, despite his best efforts to maintain the sensible resolve he had held so firmly only moments before. He thought of his careful decision to keep his distance, the responsible reasoning he had constructed so thoroughly in his own mind, and recognized, with a kind of rueful amusement, exactly how quickly all of it was about to unravel. He called for paper and ink before he had fully decided to respond, and found himself writing his acceptance before any further sensible arguments could stop him. The following afternoon, Edmund arrived at Hyde Park earlier than necessary, a fact he refused to examine too closely, and found Cecilia already waiting near the entrance, dressed simply in a walking gown of soft green, accompanied by a young maid who kept a respectful distance behind them. You came, Cecilia said, and there was something in her voice, some quiet note of relief she did not quite manage to hide, that told Edmund she had not been entirely certain he would. You asked for my expertise on horses, Edmund said. I could hardly refuse a lady in such evident distress over the subject. Cecilia's answering smile was warm and unguarded. I confess, my distress is not quite as severe as I implied. I simply wished for your company, and thought a request for expertise sounded considerably less forward than admitting as much directly. Edmund found himself laughing, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised him with how easily it came. Miss Hartwell, I begin to suspect you are considerably more forward than London society gives you credit for. London society, Cecilia said, taking his offered arm as they began a slow walk along the path, matching her pace easily and without comment to the rhythm of his cane, has never given me nearly enough credit for anything, which I have long since decided to consider its failing rather than my own. They walked for the better part of an hour, speaking of horses, of estates, of Edmund's tenant farms and the improvements he hoped to make once the harvest season allowed for it. Cecilia asked thoughtful questions and offered opinions of her own, informed by more genuine understanding of agriculture and household management than most gentlemen of Edmund's acquaintance possessed. She spoke of her own small inheritance, modest but sufficient, and of her frustration with a society that seemed to value a woman's worth entirely by the size of her dowry and the title of whatever husband she managed to secure. By the time they parted that afternoon, both understood, without either saying so directly, that this would not be their final meeting. And though neither spoke of the Duke of Wexford, nor of the whispers already circulating through London's drawing rooms, regarding the Earl and the spinster who had chosen to dance with him. Both carried home with them the quiet, unsettling awareness that something important had begun, something neither of them was entirely prepared to stop. The invitation to Lady Winterbourne's garden party arrived at the Hartwell household on a bright morning in early June, and Beatrice Hartwell received it with the particular satisfaction of a woman who understood exactly what such an invitation signified. Lady Winterbourne was known throughout London for hosting only the most select gatherings, and an invitation from her was as good as a public declaration that a family remained firmly within the good graces of society's finest circles. "The Duke will certainly be in attendance," Beatrice said, reading the card a second time, as though additional scrutiny might reveal further good fortune hidden within its elegant script. "Lady Winterbourne is his mother's dearest friend. This is precisely the sort of occasion where an understanding might be reached, Cecilia, if you would only allow yourself to be receptive to it." Cecilia set down her teacup with more care than the moment strictly required, buying herself a few seconds to compose a response that would not immediately reignite the argument she had been having with her aunt, in various forms, for nearly a fortnight. "I intend to attend the party, Aunt. I make no promises beyond that. That is all I ask," Beatrice said, though her expression suggested she hoped for considerably more. The garden party, when the day arrived, proved to be exactly the sort of elaborate affair Cecilia had come to expect from Lady Winterbourne's careful hosting. Tables draped in white linen dotted the manicured lawns behind Winterbourne House. Musicians played softly from a raised platform near the ornamental fountain, and London's finest families moved among the roses in their most carefully chosen finery, each conversation a small performance for the benefit of whoever might be listening nearby. Cecilia had not expected to see Edmund Ashworth among the guests, given the more intimate nature of Lady Winterbourne's usual gatherings, and she felt an unexpected lift in her spirits upon spotting him near the edge of the rose garden, speaking quietly with his sister Margaret. He had not seen her yet, and for a moment she simply watched him, noting the ease with which he leaned against a low stone wall, using it discreetly to steady himself in a manner that drew no particular attention from those around him. Their weeks of quiet correspondence and occasional walks together had settled into something Cecilia found herself increasingly reluctant to examine too closely, for fear that naming it directly might somehow diminish its fragile, uncertain shape. She knew only that she found herself thinking of him more often than seemed entirely reasonable, and that his letters, thoughtful and often quietly funny in ways few people expected from a man society had reduced to a single visible difficulty, had become something she looked forward to with an eagerness she was careful to hide from her aunt. "Miss Hartwell." The voice, deep and confident, came from just behind her, and Cecilia turned to find the Duke of Wexford approaching, resplendent in a coat of deep blue that had clearly been chosen with considerable care. "I had hoped to find you here today." "Your Grace," Cecilia said, offering the proper curtsy the moment demanded. "How pleasant to see you." Alistair Vane smiled, the practiced, confident smile of a man who had rarely encountered a room that did not respond favorably to his presence. "I understand you have been keeping rather unusual company of late, Miss Hartwell. The Earl of Rivenhall, I am told." Cecilia felt herself stiffen slightly at the deliberate emphasis he placed on the word unusual, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Lord Rivenhall is an acquaintance of mine. Yes, a pleasant one." "I am certain he is," the Duke said, his tone smooth and unbothered, though something calculating flickered briefly behind his eyes. "Though I confess I am surprised. A woman of your qualities, spending her time on a man so evidently diminished by circumstance, when there are other, more suitable arrangements available to her." "Lord Rivenhall is diminished in nothing but the estimation of small-minded people, Your Grace," Cecilia said, her voice cool despite the heat rising in her chest. "His leg troubles him, his character does not." The Duke's smile did not waver, though something in his posture shifted, a subtle recalibration Cecilia recognized from previous conversations with men who had expected an easy agreement and found themselves, instead, mildly challenged. Of course, I meant no offense, Miss Hartwell. I only wish to ensure your happiness is properly considered, given your evident charms and the many advantages a more fortunate match might offer you." "My happiness," Cecilia said, "is a matter I am quite capable of considering for myself." "Naturally," the Duke said smoothly, though his gaze drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the rose garden, where Edmund still stood in quiet conversation with his sister. Though I wonder if Lord Rivenhall himself has fully considered what such an attachment might cost you. A woman's reputation is a delicate thing, Miss Hartwell, and society can be unforgiving toward those who attach themselves too closely to circumstances it finds uncomfortable to witness. Before Cecilia could formulate a response sharp enough to match the quiet threat beneath his polished words, Lady Winterbourne herself appeared at the Duke's elbow, drawing him away with practiced social skill toward a group of visiting dignitaries, eager for his attention. Cecilia remained where she stood for a long moment, her hands clenched slightly at her sides, the Duke's carefully chosen words settling uncomfortably in her thoughts. She did not seek Edmund out immediately, needing a few minutes to compose herself before trusting her own expression not to betray the unease the conversation had left behind. When she finally approached the rose garden, Margaret had already excused herself to speak with other guests, and Edmund stood alone near the low stone wall, watching Cecilia's approach with quiet warmth that faded slightly as he noted the tension still visible in her posture. "You look as though you have just survived a battle," Edmund observed, his tone light, but his eyes attentive. "Something of the sort," Cecilia admitted. "The Duke of Wexford was kind enough to share his concerns regarding my choice of company." Edmund's expression sobered slightly. "I imagine I featured prominently in those concerns." "You did," Cecilia said, seeing no purpose in pretending otherwise, though I assured him my happiness was not his to arrange. "Cecilia," Edmund used her given name for the first time, and the small intimacy of it seemed to surprise them both. "I would not wish to be the cause of difficulty between you and a man who could offer you every advantage society values. If my company invites this sort of pressure, perhaps it would be wiser for us to—" "Do not," Cecilia interrupted, more sharply than she intended. "Finish that sentence, Edmund." He fell silent, watching her with an expression she could not entirely read. "I have spent 6 years of my life being told what would be wisest for me," Cecilia continued, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. "Wisest to accept the first respectable offer that came my way, regardless of the character behind it. Wisest to abandon my own preferences in favor of whatever arrangement my family or society deemed most advantageous. I am tired, Edmund, of being told what is wisest by people who have never once asked what I actually want." "And what do you want?" Edmund asked quietly. Cecilia held his gaze for a long moment, the noise of the garden party fading into something distant and unimportant around them. "I want to spend my afternoons with someone who speaks to me as though my thoughts matter, rather than someone who has already decided the shape my life should take before troubling to learn anything about me at all. I want honesty, Edmund. Not pity, and not obligation. Simply honesty." "Then I shall give you nothing less," Edmund said. They remained in the rose garden a while longer, speaking of smaller, gentler things, the Duke's veiled warning gradually losing its sharp edges beneath the easy comfort of Edmund's company. But as the afternoon wore on and other guests began to notice the length of their conversation, whispered comments started to circulate quietly among Lady Winterbourne's carefully chosen assembly, comments that would, by the following morning, have transformed into considerably less charitable gossip making its way through London's finest drawing rooms. Margaret Ashworth found her brother later that evening, back at his own townhouse, staring into the fireplace with an expression she had not seen on his face in the 3 years since his accident. "You are falling in love with her," Margaret said, settling into the chair across from him, without waiting for an invitation. Edmund did not deny it, though he did not immediately confirm it either. "She sees me, Margaret. Not the leg, not the cane, not the pity everyone else seems compelled to offer. She simply sees me." "Then you must be honest with her," Margaret said gently, "about what a future together might actually cost her." "The Duke will not simply step aside, Edmund. Men like Alistair Vane do not lose gracefully, and Cecilia's family will not easily forgive her for choosing you over a Duke's fortune and title." "I know," Edmund said quietly, watching the fire dance and shift before him. "I know exactly what it might cost her. I only hope she is prepared for what is coming, because I fear the Duke of Wexford does not intend to withdraw his interest without a considerable fight." Margaret said nothing further, recognizing in her brother's expression a resolve she had not seen since before the accident had taken so much of his confidence away. Whatever quiet battle was beginning to take shape around Cecilia Hartwell and the two men vying, in very different ways, for her affection, Margaret suspected it was only the opening skirmish of something considerably larger still to come. Word of the garden party conversation between Cecilia and the Earl of Rivenhall spread through London's drawing rooms, with the particular speed reserved for gossip that combined scandal, sympathy, and the delicious possibility of a duke being denied something he clearly wanted. By the time a full week had passed, Cecilia found herself the subject of speculation everywhere she went, her name mentioned in the same breath as both Edmund's and the duke's, as though she had become a prize to be fought over, rather than a woman entitled to her own preferences. The Duke of Wexford, for his part, did not withdraw quietly. He arrived at the Hartwell residence on a Tuesday afternoon, announced formally by the family's aging butler, and was shown into the drawing room, where Beatrice Hartwell greeted him with the barely restrained excitement of a woman who suspected, correctly, exactly what purpose his visit served. "Your Grace," Beatrice said, rising quickly to greet him. "What an honor. Cecilia will be down directly." When Cecilia entered the drawing room a few minutes later, she found the Duke standing near the window, his posture relaxed and confident, the posture of a man entirely certain of the outcome of whatever conversation he had come to have. "Miss Hartwell," he said, bowing slightly, "I wonder if I might have a few private words with you, if your aunt would permit it." Beatrice, needing no further encouragement, excused herself with visible eagerness, leaving Cecilia alone with the Duke, in a silence that stretched a moment longer than comfortable. "I will come directly to my purpose," the Duke said, once Beatrice's footsteps had faded from the hallway. "I have admired you since our first meeting, Miss Hartwell, and I believe you would make an excellent Duchess of Wexford. I am asking for your hand in marriage." The words landed with the weight of formality Cecilia had known, on some level, were coming, though hearing them spoken so plainly still sent a small jolt through her chest. She had imagined, over the years, various versions of a proposal from a man of considerable standing, and none of them had felt quite as hollow as this moment did in practice. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I am honored by your regard, but I find myself needing time to consider such an important decision fully." Something flickered briefly across the Duke's composed features, a small crack in his confident certainty. "Time, Miss Hartwell? Forgive me, but I had rather hoped my offer would require no great deliberation. I am, after all, offering you a position few women could reasonably hesitate to accept." "I do not doubt the advantages of the position you offer," Cecilia said, choosing her words with care. "I simply believe that marriage deserves more consideration than a swift acceptance based on title and fortune alone." The Duke studied her for a long moment, his expression gradually settling back into its practiced smoothness, though something colder now lingered beneath it. "I understand, Miss Hartwell, that you have been spending considerable time in the company of the Earl of Rivenhall. I wonder if perhaps that association has clouded your judgment regarding what truly serves your interests." "My judgment," Cecilia said evenly, "remains entirely my own, Your Grace, regardless of whose company I choose to keep." "Of course," the Duke said, though his tone suggested he found the answer less than satisfactory. "I shall await your consideration then, Miss Hartwell, though I hope you will not take too long. A man in my position has other prospects available to him, and patience, while a virtue, is not infinite." After the Duke departed, Beatrice returned to the drawing room within minutes, her expression a mixture of anxious hope and barely contained excitement. "Well, what did he say? What did you say?" "He proposed marriage," Cecilia said quietly. "I asked for time to consider." Beatrice's face fell into an expression of open dismay. "Time? Cecilia, a duke does not offer marriage lightly, and he certainly does not expect to be kept waiting while you consider whether he is good enough for you. Do you understand what you are risking?" "I understand exactly what I am risking, Aunt," Cecilia said, more sharply than she intended. "I am risking a marriage to a man who speaks of my association with Lord Rivenhall as though it were a stain to be washed away, rather than a friendship I value deeply. I would rather remain unmarried the rest of my days than bind myself to someone who views me as a prize to be claimed, rather than a person to be understood." "You speak as though love were the only consideration worth weighing," Beatrice said, her voice softening slightly, despite her evident frustration. "But love does not pay for a household, Cecilia, nor does it secure your position, should misfortune befall this family. I have watched women choose romantic notions over practical security, and I have watched them suffer terribly for it in later years, once the warmth of youthful feeling has faded, and only hardship remains. Then perhaps, Cecilia said quietly, I would rather face hardship honestly than comfort dishonestly. Beatrice said nothing further, though her expression carried a weariness that suggested the argument, however unresolved, was far from finished. That same evening, Cecilia wrote a letter to Edmund, describing the Duke's proposal and her request for time to consider it, though she stopped short of revealing the full extent of her family's pressure or the coldness that had crept into the Duke's final words. She did not wish to burden Edmund with worries that were, ultimately, her own to carry. Edmund's response arrived the following morning, brief but carefully considered. Cecilia, I will not pretend the news does not trouble me, though not for the reasons you might expect. I do not fear losing you to a duke's fortune, for I know your character too well to believe fortune alone could sway you. I fear, instead, that my presence in your life has become a burden you did not ask to carry, a complication standing between you and the peace such a match might otherwise offer. I would rather see you happy and secure, even at the cost of my own preference, than see you suffer the consequences of choosing difficulty over ease, merely out of loyalty to our friendship. Please, consider carefully what will truly bring you contentment, and do not let concern for my feelings weigh upon that decision. Yours, always honestly, Edmund. Cecilia read the letter 3 times, each reading leaving her with a growing frustration that had little to do with the Duke, and everything to do with the careful, self-sacrificing distance she sensed opening in Edmund's words. She recognized, with a flash of clarity, exactly what he was attempting to do, quietly withdrawing himself from consideration, before society's pressure could force the decision on her terms rather than her own. She did not respond to the letter immediately, choosing instead to spend the following days in careful thought, weighing not only her own feelings but the shape of the life she genuinely wanted, separate from what her aunt expected, separate from what the Duke assumed was inevitable, and separate, too, from whatever quiet sacrifice Edmund seemed determined to make on her behalf. Meanwhile, the Duke of Wexford, unaccustomed to delay and increasingly irritated by Cecilia's continued hesitation, began quietly making inquiries of his own, seeking information regarding the Earl of Rivenhall's financial situation, his standing among his peers, and any weakness that might be leveraged to hasten Cecilia's decision in his favor. He was a man unused to losing, and the prospect of losing to a crippled earl of modest means, however unlikely such an outcome seemed, had begun to needle at his considerable pride in ways he found increasingly difficult to ignore. What he discovered in those quiet inquiries would, within days, set in motion a chain of events neither Cecilia nor Edmund fully anticipated. Events that would test not only their growing affection for one another, but the very foundations of the reputations both had worked so carefully to protect. The letters between Edmund and Cecilia continued through the following weeks, growing gradually longer and more revealing with each exchange, as though the safety of paper and ink allowed both of them to speak more freely than they might have dared in person. Cecilia kept every letter Edmund sent her in a small wooden box beneath her bed, a habit she had not admitted even to herself until the collection had grown large enough that hiding it required genuine effort. In one letter, Edmund wrote of his childhood at Rivenhall, of long summer mornings spent racing his sister across the estate's wide fields on horseback, long before any accident had taken that particular joy away from him. He wrote of his father's death when he was only 19, an event that had thrust the responsibilities of an earldom upon him far earlier than he had ever expected, and of the quiet loneliness that had followed, made worse in later years by the isolation his injury had imposed upon him. I do not tell you this, seeking sympathy, he wrote, but because I find myself wanting you to know the whole of me, not merely the version society has decided to see. Before the accident, I confess I was rather proud of the ease with which I moved through the world. I did not consider, until I lost it, how much of my own sense of worth had been built upon such a fragile foundation. It has been a difficult lesson, learning to find value in myself that does not depend upon what my body can or cannot do. Cecilia responded with equal honesty, describing the winter she lost both her parents within the same terrible season, an illness that swept through their small country house and left her, at 12 years old, entirely dependent upon an aunt who loved her deeply, but had never quite known how to express that love in ways that felt like warmth rather than obligation. I have spent most of my life, she wrote, being told what would be best for me by people who meant well, but rarely troubled to ask what I actually wanted. I learned early that the safest way to protect my own feelings was to guard them carefully, revealing very little of my true self to anyone who might use that knowledge against me later. It is, I think, why so many in society consider me difficult, or too direct, or unsuitably outspoken for a woman of my station. I simply grew tired, somewhere along the way, of pretending to be smaller than I actually am. Reading these words, Edmund found himself understanding Cecilia in a way he suspected few people ever had, and he recognized, with a growing certainty he could no longer easily dismiss, that whatever he felt for her had grown well beyond simple friendship or gratitude for a single kind gesture at a ball. He loved her, plainly and completely, in a way that frightened him, precisely because of how much he now stood to lose, should circumstances force them apart. It was during this period of quiet correspondence that Edmund's fear of becoming a burden to her began to take firmer shape in his mind. He noticed, whenever they met at smaller gatherings arranged discreetly by Margaret or by Henry Whitfield, the subtle glances that followed them, the whispers that grew slightly louder whenever Cecilia chose to sit beside him, rather than among the more fashionable company available elsewhere in the room. He noticed, too, the strain occasionally visible around Cecilia's eyes after these gatherings, a tiredness she attempted to hide, but could not fully disguise from someone who had grown as attentive to her moods as Edmund had become. At a small dinner party hosted by Henry Whitfield and his wife, Edmund watched Cecilia deflect a pointed comment from another guest regarding her continued unmarried status, her response quick and composed, but the fatigue beneath her composure unmistakable to anyone paying close enough attention. "You seem tired tonight," Edmund said quietly, once the other guests had moved on to different conversation. "It is nothing," Cecilia said, though her smile did not quite reach her eyes. "Simply the usual questions, dressed up in slightly different clothing each time they are asked." "I could withdraw from these gatherings," Edmund offered carefully. "If my presence invites more of these questions than you would otherwise face, I would understand entirely." Cecilia turned to him with an expression that was, for the first time in their acquaintance, genuinely sharp with frustration. "Edmund, I do not need you to protect me from questions I have faced my entire adult life, with or without your presence. I have survived worse scrutiny than a few pointed comments at a dinner party, and I will continue surviving it regardless of whether you remain by my side or retreat somewhere safer on my behalf." "I only meant—" "I know what you meant," Cecilia interrupted, her voice softening slightly, though the frustration remained. "You meant to be noble, and self-sacrificing, and considerate of my feelings above your own. But Edmund, I did not choose your company because I needed protecting from the world's opinions. I chose it because I value you, exactly as you are, and I would ask that you extend me the same courtesy of trusting my own judgment regarding what I am willing to endure." Edmund fell silent, recognizing the truth in her words even as old habits of self-protection whispered their familiar warnings in the back of his mind. He had spent 3 years learning to expect rejection, to anticipate the moment when even the kindest person eventually grew tired of the complications his injury brought into their lives. It was, he realized slowly, a difficult habit to unlearn, even in the face of someone who had shown him nothing but consistent, unwavering acceptance. "I am trying," he admitted quietly, "to protect you from a mistake I fear you may come to regret." "The only mistake I fear regretting," Cecilia said, her voice gentle now, "is allowing fear, whether yours or society's, to convince me to walk away from something genuinely good, simply because it arrived, wrapped in complications neither of us chose." They did not resolve the tension entirely that evening, though something shifted quietly between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that whatever future they might build together would require both of them to fight, not merely against the whispers of London society, but against their own individual instincts toward self-protective retreat. In the days that followed, the Duke of Wexford's patience, already thin, grew thinner still. His inquiries into Edmund's affairs had revealed nothing scandalous, no hidden debts or improprieties he could use to discourage Cecilia's continued friendship with the Earl, and the absence of any convenient weakness to exploit left him increasingly frustrated by a situation he had expected to resolve easily in his favor. He began, instead, a quieter campaign, dropping careful remarks in the hearing of mutual acquaintances, suggesting gently that Cecilia's continued association with Edmund Ashworth reflected poorly on her judgment, that a woman of her age could ill afford the luxury of romantic idealism when practical security remained so readily available to her. These remarks, filtered through the usual channels of London gossip, began reaching Beatrice Hartwell's ears with increasing frequency, each retelling adding fresh urgency to her efforts to convince her niece toward a swifter, more sensible decision. "The Duke will not wait forever," Beatrice warned Cecilia one evening, as the two sat together in the drawing room, following another day of pointed social commentary. "And once his patience expires, Cecilia, I fear you will find yourself with neither a duke's fortune nor an earl's steady companionship, but simply the reputation of a foolish woman who let her romantic notions cost her every practical advantage she once possessed." Cecilia said nothing in response, though privately she recognized the growing pressure building around her from every direction, pressure that would soon require a decision considerably more definitive than the careful, private affection she and Edmund had allowed themselves to nurture in quiet correspondence and discreet gatherings alone. The formal proposal, when it finally arrived, came not in the quiet privacy Cecilia might have preferred, but at a musical evening hosted by Lady Winterbourne, in front of a carefully assembled audience of London's most influential families. The Duke of Wexford had grown tired of waiting for a private answer he suspected might not favor him, and so he chose instead to force the matter into the open, calculating, correctly, that public expectation would apply pressure Cecilia's private resolve alone might struggle to withstand. The evening began innocently enough, with a string quartet performing in Lady Winterbourne's elegant music room, while guests mingled during the intervals between pieces, discussing the performance and exchanging the usual pleasantries expected of such gatherings. Cecilia had arrived with her aunt, aware that Edmund would be present as well, having received an invitation through Margaret's careful arrangement, though the two had exchanged only brief, formal greetings upon arrival, mindful of the watching eyes that seemed to follow their every interaction these days.
It was during the interval following the second piece that the Duke rose from his seat, positioning himself near the center of the room in a manner clearly calculated to draw attention, and requested, in a voice pitched to carry across the gathered assembly, a moment of Cecilia's time.
"Miss Hartwell," he said, once a curious hush had settled over the room, "I have waited some weeks now for your answer to a question I posed to you privately. I wonder if you might do me the honor of providing that answer now, before our assembled friends, so that this matter might finally be settled to everyone's satisfaction." Cecilia felt her stomach drop as every head in the room turned toward her, understanding immediately the trap the Duke had constructed. To refuse an answer now would appear evasive, even cowardly, feeding exactly the kind of gossip that had already begun circulating regarding her hesitation. To delay further would only invite more of the same pressure she had already endured for weeks. She rose slowly from her seat, aware of her aunt's anxious expression beside her, aware too of Edmund's careful stillness across the room, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that betrayed how closely he understood the significance of this moment. "Your Grace," Cecilia said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her own heart, "I did not expect to answer such a personal question in so public a setting, but perhaps it is fitting that I do so, given how public this courtship has already become, through no particular choice of my own." A ripple of anticipation moved through the assembled guests, fans pausing mid-motion, conversations falling silent, as everyone leaned forward to catch whatever answer was about to be given. "You have offered me a position many women would consider the fulfillment of every ambition society teaches us to hold," Cecilia continued. "Wealth, title, security, beyond question. I do not dismiss the value of these things, nor do I judge any woman who might choose them gladly. But I have come to understand, over these past weeks, that I cannot build a marriage upon foundations that do not include genuine respect and understanding between two people. And I fear, Your Grace, that despite your evident regard for my more visible qualities, you have shown remarkably little interest in understanding who I actually am." The Duke's composed expression flickered, a flash of genuine surprise and, beneath it, something colder beginning to surface. "Miss Hartwell, I hardly think this is the venue for—" "You chose this venue, Your Grace," Cecilia said, more firmly now, "and so I shall give my answer here, as you requested. I must decline your generous offer of marriage, not because I fail to appreciate the advantages it offers, but because I have found, in another's company, A depth of understanding and honesty I am unwilling to trade away for the sake of title and fortune alone." The room erupted into a low murmur of astonished conversation, and Cecilia was aware, distantly, of her aunt's small gasp beside her, of the Duke's carefully controlled fury, visible now beneath his rapidly cooling composure. But her attention had already shifted across the room, to where Edmund stood frozen near the window, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dawning hope. "Another's company," the Duke repeated, his voice tightening, despite his evident effort to maintain some measure of dignity before the watching crowd. "I assume you refer to the Earl of Rivenhall." "I do," Cecilia said plainly, refusing to soften the admission, despite the murmurs growing louder around them. "You would choose a crippled Earl of modest means," the Duke said, his careful composure finally cracking entirely, "over a Duke's fortune, his title, and everything that would come with it. Miss Hartwell, I confess I did not take you for a fool, but perhaps I was mistaken." The word landed harshly in the sudden hush that followed, and Cecilia felt her own anger rise sharply in response, though she kept her voice carefully controlled. "Lord Rivenhall's leg does not diminish his character, Your Grace. Whatever it may have cost his standing in the estimation of men who value only what can be seen at a glance. I would rather spend my life with a man of genuine substance than with one who mistakes his own title for the entirety of his worth." A few scattered gasps followed this remark, along with, Cecilia noted with some satisfaction, several quietly approving nods from guests, who had perhaps grown tired themselves of the Duke's evident self-regard. The Duke, recognizing the shifting mood of the room and the damage already done to his own dignity, offered a stiff, formal bow. "Then I wish you joy of your choice, Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice cold, "and I hope, for your sake, that the Earl's charms prove sufficient compensation for everything else you will be giving up." He turned and departed the music room without further ceremony, leaving behind a gathering buzzing with astonished conversation and speculation that would, by morning, have transformed into the most discussed piece of gossip London's drawing rooms had encountered in months. Beatrice Hartwell sat frozen in her seat for several long moments, her expression caught somewhere between horror at the public spectacle and a grudging, reluctant admiration for the courage her niece had just displayed before an audience that would show her little mercy in the days to come. "Cecilia," she finally managed, her voice unsteady, "what have you done?" "I have chosen honestly, Aunt," Cecilia said quietly, though her hands trembled slightly now that the moment's adrenaline had begun to fade. "Whatever comes of it, I could not have chosen otherwise, and remained true to myself." Across the room, Edmund had begun making his way toward her, moving with careful deliberation through the crowd of guests who parted before him with expressions ranging from open curiosity to something that looked, remarkably, like respect. When he finally reached her side, he said nothing for a long moment, simply studying her face, as though committing the sight of her to memory. "You did not need to do that," he said quietly, once he trusted his voice enough to speak. "You did not need to declare yourself so publicly, Cecilia, nor risk your own standing so completely on my account." "I did not do it for your account alone," Cecilia said, meeting his gaze steadily, despite the whispers still swirling around them. "I did it because I am tired of pretending my own feelings matter less than everyone else's expectations. I did it because I choose you, Edmund, plainly and completely, and I am no longer willing to hide that choice behind careful discretion and private letters." Edmund's expression, still marked by the disbelief of the past several minutes, softened slowly into something that looked, unmistakably, like joy. "Then I am the most fortunate man in this room," he said, however unlikely that claim might have seemed to anyone watching only 3 months ago. The gathered guests, still buzzing with the scandal of the evening's events, would carry word of this remarkable exchange throughout London for weeks to come, though neither Cecilia nor Edmund paid much attention, in that particular moment, to the whispers still circling around them. Whatever difficulties lay ahead, whatever consequences Cecilia's public declaration might yet bring upon her reputation, both understood, standing together amid Lady Winterbourne's scattered guests, that they had crossed some important threshold neither one intended to retreat from now. The morning after Lady Winterbourne's musical evening, London woke to gossip of a kind rarely seen even in a city that thrived on scandal. By breakfast, 3 separate households had already sent notes to the Hartwell residence, ostensibly offering sympathy, but transparently fishing for further details. By afternoon, Cecilia's name had become inseparable in every drawing room conversation, from a story that grew more exaggerated with each retelling, until she had been transformed, in the space of a single day, from a respected, if unmarried gentlewoman, into either a romantic heroine or a foolish woman who had thrown away her future, depending entirely upon who told the tale. Beatrice Hartwell bore the brunt of this attention with visible strain, receiving callers throughout the day who arrived under the pretense of concern, but left with fresh material for their own gossip. By evening, exhausted and increasingly anxious, she confronted her niece in the quiet of the drawing room, her earlier grudging admiration for Cecilia's courage, now buried beneath fresh waves of practical worry. "Do you understand what you have done to this family's standing?" Beatrice asked, her voice tight with a fatigue that went beyond simple tiredness. "3 families have already withdrawn their invitations for next week's gatherings, citing prior engagements that I suspect exist nowhere but in their imagination. The Wexford family carries considerable influence, Cecilia, and a duke does not take public rejection lightly, particularly not one delivered before half of London's finest families." "I understand the cost, Aunt," Cecilia said quietly, though the weight of the day's events had left her own composure considerably thinner than it had been the previous evening. "I do not regret my answer, but I confess I had not fully anticipated how swiftly and how thoroughly society would move to punish it." "Society does not forgive easily," Beatrice said, some of her earlier sharpness softening into genuine worry. "Especially not women who step outside the boundaries it has drawn for them. I fear for you, Cecilia. I fear what remains of your prospects, should this attachment to Lord Rivenhall falter for any reason, leaving you with neither the Duke's protection nor whatever security the Earl might have offered." Cecilia said nothing for a long moment, turning her aunt's words over in her mind, even as her own doubts, carefully suppressed since the previous evening's public declaration, began surfacing with uncomfortable clarity. She did not regret her choice, not truly, but she recognized, with growing unease, the genuine difficulties that choice had now set into motion, difficulties that extended well beyond her own reputation, into her aunt's social standing, and, potentially, the family's broader financial security, dependent as it remained upon connections and goodwill that seemed, suddenly, considerably more fragile than she had previously understood. Across London, Edmund faced a different but equally troubling reception. His own sister Margaret, initially delighted by the public declaration of affection between her brother and Cecilia, grew increasingly concerned as reports reached her of the social consequences already befalling the Hartwell family. "You must consider carefully what this means for her, Edmund," Margaret said, visiting her brother's townhouse the following afternoon, with an expression far graver than her earlier enthusiasm had suggested. "The Duke of Wexford is not a man who accepts public humiliation gracefully. I have heard already that he has begun speaking quite pointedly against Cecilia's judgment in several influential circles, and against your own character as well, suggesting that you allowed her to make such a declaration, knowing full well the damage it would cause her standing." "I never asked her to declare herself so publicly," Edmund said, a familiar knot of guilt tightening in his chest. "I would have been content to continue our friendship quietly, without forcing her into a position that cost her so dearly." "I know that," Margaret said gently. "But Edmund, the damage is done regardless of your intentions, and I fear it will only grow worse before it grows better. You must ask yourself honestly whether you are prepared to offer her a life that genuinely compensates for everything she has now sacrificed on your account. A modest earldom, however respectable, cannot easily replace the security and standing a duke's fortune would have provided." Edmund sat in troubled silence for a long while after his sister departed, the old, familiar doubts he had struggled against for weeks, now returning with renewed force. He thought of Cecilia's fierce insistence, weeks earlier, that she did not need his protection from the consequences of her own choices, and he recognized the truth in her words, even as fresh worry gnawed at his resolve. It was one thing to accept, in the abstract, that she wished to choose him despite the difficulties involved. It was another thing entirely to watch those difficulties materialize so swiftly and so publicly, threatening not only her own reputation but her aunt's social standing, and, potentially, the modest financial security her family depended upon, through various social connections, now visibly cooling in the aftermath of her public rejection of the Duke. 2 days later, Edmund received an unexpected visit from Henry Whitfield, who arrived at his townhouse with an expression of unusual gravity. "There is more you should know," Henry said, once he had been shown into Edmund's study, and the door closed behind them. "The Duke has been making inquiries into your finances, Edmund, and has begun suggesting, quite deliberately, in certain circles, that your interest in Cecilia stems partly from her modest inheritance, given the difficulties your own estate has faced, since your accident interrupted your management of it." Edmund felt a cold anger settle in his chest, sharper than the guilt and doubt that had plagued him these past several days. "That is a lie, Henry, and the Duke knows it perfectly well." "I do not doubt it," Henry said, "but you know as well as I do that a lie repeated often enough, by a man of sufficient standing, gains a life of its own, regardless of its truth. If this rumor takes hold, Edmund, it will not only damage your own reputation, but Cecilia's as well, suggesting that she has been deceived by a fortune hunter, rather than choosing a genuine, honorable attachment." Edmund sat in heavy silence, absorbing this fresh complication, with a growing sense that the walls were closing in around a happiness he had only just begun to allow himself to trust. He thought of Cecilia, already bearing the weight of society's disapproval on his account, now facing the additional insult of having her judgment questioned regarding his own motives. He thought, too, of his own long-held fear, first formed in the months following his accident, that he had become fundamentally unworthy of the kind of easy, uncomplicated affection he had once taken for granted, a burden to anyone foolish enough to attach themselves to his diminished circumstances. That evening, without informing Margaret or Henry of his intentions, Edmund wrote a letter to Cecilia, the most difficult letter he had composed since their acquaintance began. "Cecilia, I have learned today of rumors being spread regarding my own motives in courting you, rumors suggesting I seek only your modest inheritance to compensate for my own estate's difficulties. I do not believe you would credit such falsehoods, but I find myself increasingly troubled by the broader cost my presence in your life continues to exact. Your aunt's standing suffers. Your own reputation grows more complicated by the day. I begin to fear that whatever affection exists between us, however genuine, cannot outweigh the mounting difficulties my circumstances continue to bring into your life. Perhaps it would be wiser, for both our sakes, if I withdrew from your company for a time, allowing the current storm of gossip to settle, before either of us commits further to a path that may cost you more than either of us initially understood. I do not say this lightly, nor without considerable pain of my own, but I would rather bear that pain myself than watch you continue to suffer on my account. Yours, with continued regard, Edmund." He sent the letter before he could reconsider, and spent the following days in a state of quiet misery, uncertain whether he had done the honorable thing or made the greatest mistake of his life. Cecilia read Edmund's letter 3 times before the full weight of its meaning settled fully into her understanding, and with each reading, her initial hurt gradually transformed into something closer to anger. She recognized, with painful clarity, exactly what Edmund was attempting to do, the same quiet, self-sacrificing retreat he had threatened once before at Henry Whitfield's dinner party, except this time, carried through to its full conclusion, rather than merely hinted at in a moment of doubt. She did not respond by letter. Instead, the following morning, she called for her family's carriage and directed the driver to Edmund's townhouse, ignoring her aunt's startled protests regarding the impropriety of a young unmarried woman calling upon a gentleman's residence without prior arrangement. Edmund's butler, clearly uncertain how to handle such an unusual visit, showed Cecilia into the study where Edmund sat, still surrounded by the same troubled correspondence and unresolved estate business that had occupied him since sending his letter 2 days earlier. He rose quickly upon seeing her, his expression a mixture of surprise and evident discomfort. "Cecilia, I did not expect—" "Clearly not," Cecilia interrupted, closing the study door behind her, with more force than strictly necessary. "Since you seem to have made a rather significant decision regarding both our futures, without troubling to consult me on the matter first." "I wrote to explain my reasoning," Edmund said, though his voice lacked conviction even to his own ears. "You wrote to inform me of a decision already made," Cecilia said, crossing the room to stand directly before him, her earlier anger now fully unleashed. "Edmund, I have spent the past week enduring my aunt's anxious lectures, 3 separate withdrawn invitations, and whispered comments from women I once considered friends, all because I chose, openly and honestly, to declare my regard for you before an audience that clearly relished the opportunity to judge me for it. And now, rather than standing beside me through the consequences of that choice, you have decided, entirely on your own, that the wisest course is to retreat, leaving me to bear the whole of society's disapproval alone, while you protect yourself from further complication. I am not protecting myself, Edmund said, stung by the accusation despite recognizing some uncomfortable truth within it. I am trying to protect you, Cecilia, from a burden that grows heavier by the day. A burden I fear will only continue to cost you more than you initially understood. Do you truly believe, Cecilia said, her voice rising now with a passion she rarely allowed herself to display so openly, that I made my declaration, at Lady Winterbourne's musical evening, without understanding exactly what it would cost me? I am not a foolish girl swept away by romantic notions, Edmund. I am a woman of 26 years, who has spent a great deal of time considering precisely what I was risking, and who chose, with clear eyes and full understanding, to accept that risk because I believed, and continue to believe, that you are worth it. Edmund fell silent, the force of her conviction settling uncomfortably against the careful, self-protective logic he had constructed over the past several sleepless nights. You speak of protecting me, Cecilia continued, quieter now, but no less firm. Yet you have never once asked me what I actually need protecting from, or whether I even want your protection at all. You assume, Edmund, exactly as everyone else in my life has assumed for years, that you know better than I do what will make me happy, what risks I am capable of bearing, what future best suits my own understanding of my life. I chose you, fully and deliberately. I did not ask to be rescued from that choice by your own doubts regarding your worthiness of it. My leg, Edmund began, my estate's difficulties, the rumors now circulating regarding my motives. None of that, Cecilia interrupted firmly, was ever the true obstacle standing between us, Edmund. The true obstacle has always been your own conviction that you are somehow less deserving of happiness than other men, that your injury has diminished not only your leg, but your fundamental right to be loved without qualification or apology. I have never once viewed you as diminished, Edmund. I have viewed you, since the very first evening we spoke at that terrible ball, as a man of genuine character and substance, whose worth has never depended upon the strength of his leg, but upon the strength of his heart and mind, both of which remain entirely intact. Edmund stood in stunned silence, Cecilia's words landing with the particular force of truths he had suspected but never fully allowed himself to acknowledge. He thought of the past 3 years, the careful walls he had built around his own heart, the quiet expectation of eventual abandonment that had shaped nearly every relationship he had attempted to maintain since his accident. He thought, too, of his mother's words, spoken so long ago, warning him against teaching the world that shame was deserved by hiding from it. I have been hiding, he said quietly, the realization settling over him with considerable weight. Not from ballrooms, as my mother once feared, but from you. From the possibility that you might genuinely choose me, fully and without reservation, because some part of me has never quite believed such a choice was possible. It is not only possible, Cecilia said, her anger softening now into something gentler, though her conviction remained unwavering. It has already happened, Edmund. I have already chosen you. The only question remaining is whether you are willing to stop trying to protect me from a decision I have already made, and simply trust me enough to stand beside me through whatever consequences follow. Edmund reached for her hand, his own trembling slightly, with an emotion he had not allowed himself to fully feel in longer than he could remember. I am sorry, Cecilia. I have spent 3 years learning to expect abandonment, and it seems I have grown so accustomed to anticipating it that I nearly caused it myself, simply to avoid the pain of waiting for it to arrive on someone else's terms. Then learn something different, Cecilia said softly. Learn that I am not going anywhere, Edmund, regardless of what society decides to whisper about us in the coming weeks. Learn to trust that I meant exactly what I said at Lady Winterbourne's, and that I do not offer such declarations lightly, or without full understanding of their cost. They stood together in Edmund's study for a long while after that, speaking more openly than they had allowed themselves in weeks, addressing not only the immediate crisis of the Duke's rumors and society's disapproval, but the deeper fears each had carried into their growing attachment, fears of unworthiness and abandonment that had shaped both their lives long before they had ever met one another at that terrible, mocking ball. By the time Cecilia finally departed for home that afternoon, both understood that whatever challenges still lay ahead, whatever gossip continued circulating through London's drawing rooms regarding their unlikely attachment, they would face those challenges together rather than allowing fear or misguided self-sacrifice to drive them apart before they had truly begun. Edmund's next task, he decided, as he watched her carriage depart from his townhouse window, would be addressing the Duke's rumors directly, refusing to allow falsehoods regarding his own character to continue circulating unchecked, damaging not only his reputation but Cecilia's as well. It was time, he realized, to stop retreating from difficulty and start meeting it directly, exactly as Cecilia herself had done, so publicly and so bravely, before an entire room of London's finest families only a week before. Edmund Ashworth spent the following days doing something he had not done since long before his accident, actively seeking out the very social gatherings he had once approached with dread, not to endure them quietly at the edges of the room, but to confront directly the rumors that had begun spreading regarding his character and his motives toward Cecilia. He called first upon Lord Pemberton, whose younger sons had mocked him so cruelly at that first ball months earlier, and requested a private conversation that left the older man considerably more subdued regarding his son's continued indiscretions. "I understand your sons find amusement in mocking those they consider weaker than themselves," Edmund said, his voice steady and controlled, despite the anger still simmering beneath his composed exterior. "I would ask that you remind them, Lord Pemberton, that a title and a fortune do not constitute character, and that the mockery they so freely offer others may one day be returned to them in circumstances considerably less forgiving than a crowded ballroom." Lord Pemberton, uncomfortable with the direct confrontation but recognizing the legitimate grievance behind it, promised to speak with his sons regarding their conduct, a promise Edmund accepted with the understanding that its enforcement would likely prove imperfect but represented, nonetheless, a step in the right direction. His next visit proved considerably more difficult. Edmund called upon the Duke of Wexford directly, a decision Henry Whitfield had strongly advised against, fearing it might only inflame an already volatile situation. But Edmund had grown tired of allowing others to shape the narrative of his own character through whispered rumors and careful insinuation, and he arrived at the Duke's townhouse with a calm resolve that surprised even himself. The Duke received him with cool civility, clearly curious regarding the purpose of such an unusual visit. "Lord Rivenhall, I confess I did not expect the pleasure of your company. I have come regarding the rumors you have been spreading," Edmund said directly, seeing no purpose in softening his purpose with unnecessary pleasantries. "Suggestions that my interest in Miss Hartwell stems from her modest inheritance, rather than genuine regard. I would ask that you cease such falsehoods immediately." The Duke's composed expression flickered slightly, though he recovered quickly, his familiar smoothness settling back into place. "I merely voiced concerns regarding your financial situation, Lord Rivenhall, concerns any reasonable person might share, given the well-documented difficulties your estate has faced since your accident." "My estate's difficulties," Edmund said, "are considerably less severe than you have suggested to others, and regardless of their extent, they have nothing whatsoever to do with my regard for Cecilia, which existed long before I gave any thought to her inheritance, and which would remain entirely unchanged should she possess no fortune at all." "A convenient claim," the Duke said, his tone growing colder, though difficult to verify given the circumstances. "Perhaps," Edmund said, holding the Duke's gaze steadily, "but I would remind you, Your Grace, that spreading falsehoods regarding another man's character, particularly falsehoods clearly motivated by wounded pride, rather than genuine concern for Miss Hartwell's welfare, reflects rather poorly on your own character as well. I wonder how London's finest families might regard a duke who cannot accept a woman's honest rejection with dignity, choosing instead to pursue petty revenge through carefully planted rumor and insinuation." The Duke's expression tightened visibly, and for a long moment, the two men regarded one another in tense silence. Finally, the Duke offered a stiff, reluctant nod. "I have no further interest in this matter, Lord Rivenhall. Miss Hartwell has made her choice, however unwise I consider it, and I have no wish to continue a dispute that reflects poorly on my own standing, as much as it might on yours. Consider the matter closed." Whether the Duke's promise stemmed from genuine reconsideration or simply a calculated decision to avoid further damage to his own reputation, Edmund could not say with certainty. But in the days that followed, the rumors regarding his supposed pursuit of Cecilia's inheritance gradually began to fade, replaced instead by a growing, if grudging, fascination with the story of a crippled earl who had confronted a duke directly, rather than allowing false accusations to stand unchallenged. Cecilia, upon learning of Edmund's visits to both Lord Pemberton and the duke, felt a warmth spread through her chest that had little to do with relief regarding the fading rumors, and everything to do with recognizing, clearly, the change taking shape within the man she loved. This was not the same Edmund who had once considered quietly withdrawing from her company to spare her further difficulty. This was a man who had chosen, deliberately and with considerable courage, to meet the world's judgment directly, rather than retreating from it. "You confronted the Duke," she said, when they met again at Margaret's townhouse a few days later, her expression carrying equal parts admiration and lingering concern. "Edmund, that was considerably braver, and considerably riskier, than I expected of you." "I grew tired of hiding," Edmund said simply. "You taught me that, Cecilia, whether you intended to or not. I watched you stand before an entire room and declare your feelings honestly, regardless of the cost, and I realized I owed you, at the very least, the same courage in defending both our reputations against falsehoods neither of us deserved to bear." Over the following weeks, the intensity of society's fascination with their unlikely attachment gradually began to settle into something calmer, if not entirely approving. Some families remained cool toward the Hartwells, unwilling to fully forgive Cecilia's public rejection of a duke in favor of a lesser title. Others, however, particularly among the younger generation who had witnessed the confrontation at Lady Winterbourne's musical evening, began to view the match with something closer to admiration, seeing in Cecilia's courage and Edmund's quiet dignity a story considerably more compelling than the usual calculated arrangements of London's marriage market. Beatrice Hartwell, though she never fully abandoned her practical concerns regarding financial security, found herself gradually won over by Edmund's evident devotion to her niece, particularly after witnessing, firsthand, the careful, patient way he listened to Cecilia's opinions and treated her judgment with genuine respect, rather than the dismissive indulgence so many of Cecilia's previous suitors had offered. "I confess," Beatrice said to her niece one evening, some weeks after the initial scandal had begun to fade, "I did not expect to find myself approving of this match, but I have watched you these past months, Cecilia, and I have not seen you this genuinely happy in all the years I have known you. Perhaps there is something to be said, after all, for choosing character over convenience." It was shortly after this conversation that Edmund called upon Cecilia's family formally, requesting a private audience with Beatrice to discuss his intentions properly, as tradition demanded, though both he and Cecilia had long since settled the matter privately between themselves. "I love your niece," Edmund said simply, once he and Beatrice sat together in the Hartwell drawing room. "I cannot offer her the fortune the Duke once promised, nor the easy grace of a body untouched by injury. But I can offer her honesty, genuine partnership, and a regard for her judgment and character that I believe she has too rarely received from the men's society deemed more suitable for her attention. I would ask for your blessing to marry her, Mrs. Hartwell, though I recognize the decision ultimately rests with Cecilia herself." Beatrice studied him for a long moment, her earlier reservations finally settling into something resembling genuine acceptance. "You have my blessing, Lord Rivenhall, though I suspect you already knew you would receive it. Take care of her. She has waited a long while to find someone worthy of the considerable regard she is prepared to offer. I intend to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of exactly that," Edmund said, and Beatrice, hearing the quiet sincerity in his voice, found herself, for the first time since the whole affair had begun, entirely at peace with the path her niece had chosen. The wedding of Edmund Ashworth, Earl of Rivenhall, and Cecilia Hartwell took place on a bright autumn morning at the small parish church nearest the Rivenhall estate, a modest ceremony, deliberately chosen over the elaborate spectacle London society might have expected from a match that had, only months earlier, been the subject of the season's most talked-about scandal. Cecilia had insisted on simplicity, wanting the day to belong to herself and Edmund alone, rather than becoming another performance for society's continued fascination, and Edmund had agreed readily, having grown, over the preceding months, considerably less concerned with what society expected of him, and considerably more focused on what genuinely mattered. Margaret Ashworth stood as witness for her brother, tears of genuine joy visible throughout the ceremony, as she watched Edmund exchange vows with a woman who had, in the space of a single season, restored to her brother a happiness she had feared permanently lost following his accident. Beatrice Hartwell, seated in the front pew, dabbed at her own eyes with a handkerchief, her earlier reservations long since replaced by genuine affection for the man who had proven himself, through patience and quiet courage, worthy of her niece's regard. Henry Whitfield, who had supported the couple's growing attachment from its earliest days, offered a warm toast at the small wedding breakfast that followed, remarking with characteristic wit that he had never met two people so evidently suited to challenging the expectations placed upon them by a society far too quick to judge by appearances alone. Of the Duke of Wexford, little more was heard, following his brief, cold acknowledgement that the matter between himself and Cecilia was closed. He married, within the year, a young heiress, from a prominent northern family, a match arranged with considerably more attention to fortune than affection, and though London society continued speaking of him with the usual deference owed his title, the particular shine of his earlier confidence never quite returned in full, following his public rejection by a woman society had once dismissed as an unremarkable spinster. In the years that followed their marriage, Edmund and Cecilia built a life together at Rivenhall that bore little resemblance to the careful, performative existence expected of London's fashionable society. Edmund threw himself into the management of his estate with renewed purpose, implementing the agricultural improvements he and Cecilia had once discussed during their early walks through Hyde Park, and the tenant farms that had once struggled under the neglect of his post-accident recovery began flourishing under his attentive, if occasionally unconventional management. Cecilia, for her part, found in her marriage the genuine partnership she had long sought and rarely encountered among London's more calculating suitors. Edmund valued her opinions on matters of estate management and household affairs alike, consulting her judgment with a respect that had been entirely absent from every previous courtship she had endured, and she flourished under the freedom of finally being seen, fully and completely, by someone who valued her character above all else. They did not entirely escape society's occasional whispers, even in the years that followed. There remained those among London's finest families who continued to view the match with a certain bemused disapproval, unable to fully understand why a woman of Cecilia's evident qualities had chosen a modest earldom over a duke's considerable fortune. But such whispers grew increasingly quiet as the years passed, gradually replaced by grudging acknowledgement of the couple's evident happiness, a happiness that seemed, to those who observed it closely, considerably more genuine than the calculated arrangements that governed so many of society's more conventional marriages. Edmund's leg never fully recovered its former strength, and he continued walking with the aid of a cane for the remainder of his life, a fact that ceased, gradually but completely, to define how either he or Cecilia understood his worth. He learned, over the years of their marriage, to move through the world not as a man diminished by injury, but as a man whose character had been tested by hardship, and found, upon that testing, to be considerably stronger than the easy confidence he had once possessed before his accident. Cecilia, meanwhile, never fully lost the sharp wit and quiet defiance that had first drawn Edmund's attention on that terrible evening at Ashcombe House. Though the loneliness that had once sharpened those qualities into something closer to guarded self-protection gradually softened into a contentment few who had known her during her unmarried years might have expected to witness. She remained, throughout her life, unafraid to speak plainly, to challenge assumptions society held regarding a woman's proper place, and to defend, fiercely and without hesitation, those she loved against any who might dare to mock or diminish them. Years later, at a ball hosted by their own daughter's godmother, an elderly Cecilia watched from a quiet corner as a young man, walking with visible difficulty, following some injury of his own, hesitated at the edge of the dance floor, clearly anticipating the same cruel mockery Edmund had once endured so many years before. She watched her own daughter, raised on stories of her parents' unlikely courtship, cross the room without hesitation, and extend her hand toward the young man, exactly as Cecilia herself had once done, decades earlier, at a ball that had changed the entire course of her life. Edmund, standing beside her now, with hair gone gray, and a cane that had become, over the years, simply another familiar part of who he was, rather than a mark of shame to be hidden, followed his wife's gaze and smiled quietly at the scene unfolding before them. "It seems," he said softly, "our daughter learned something valuable from her mother." "She learned," Cecilia said, taking her husband's arm, as they had done countless times over the years that followed, that first, unlikely dance. "That kindness costs nothing, and that character has never once depended upon the strength of a man's leg or the size of his fortune. It has always depended, and will always depend, upon the strength of his heart." They watched together as their daughter led the young man onto the dance floor, the whispers that inevitably followed such an unusual sight fading quickly beneath the quiet dignity of two people refusing to be shamed by circumstances neither of them had chosen. And Edmund Ashworth, once mocked at every ball he attended, once certain his injury had cost him any chance at genuine happiness, found himself, in that quiet moment, more grateful than words could easily express for the prettiest spinster who had chosen him, all those years ago, over a duke, over society's expectations, and over every doubt he had once carried regarding his own worthiness of love. Their story, whispered still in certain London drawing rooms long after both had passed from this world, remained a quiet reminder to those willing to hear it, that genuine character, however overlooked by a society quick to judge by appearances alone, would always, in the end, prove worth considerably more than any title or fortune could ever offer.